It was a typical Friday night for me, working as a pizza delivery driver. I enjoyed my job, driving around town and making sure people got their pizzas hot and fresh. But one night, something strange happened that I will never forget. I received an order for a large pepperoni pizza. The address was on Maple Street, known for its old, creepy houses. It was almost midnight, and I felt a little uneasy, but I had a job to do. I grabbed the pizza and headed out. When I reached the house, it looked dark and abandoned. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I checked the address again. It was the right place. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. The sound echoed through the quiet street. After a few moments, the door creaked open. An old man stood there, his face hidden in shadows. He looked frail and tired. "Pizza delivery?" I asked, holding up the box. "Yes, come in," the old man said in a raspy voice. "Please bring it to the basement. I can't carry it myself." I hesitated. The idea of going into the basement of this creepy house at midnight made me nervous. But I didn't want to be rude, so I followed the old man inside. The house was dark and musty. The old man led me to a door that opened to a steep staircase. "Down there," he pointed. "Leave the pizza on the table at the bottom." I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The steps creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder as I descended. At the bottom, I found a dimly lit basement. There was an old wooden table in the center of the room. I placed the pizza on the table and turned to leave, but something caught my eye. In the corner of the basement, there was a large, old-fashioned mirror. I felt a chill as I saw my reflection. But then, I noticed something strange. In the mirror, there was a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the basement was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, watching me. It was a dark, blurry shape, almost like a shadow come to life. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the mirror. Suddenly, the old man appeared at the top of the stairs. "Did you see him?" he asked, his voice trembling. "See who?" I replied, my voice shaking. "The shadow," the old man said. "It has been here for years, haunting this house. It feeds on fear. You must leave now before it finds you." I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed up the stairs, past the old man, and out of the house. I jumped into my car and drove away as fast as I could. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I told my friends about the creepy house and the shadow in the mirror, but no one believed me. They thought it was just a story, but I knew what I saw. I never took another delivery to Maple Street again, and I made sure to avoid that house. The memory of the shadowy figure haunted me, a reminder of the night I came face to face with the unknown. It was a quiet Friday night, and I had the whole house to myself. My family had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me with a sense of freedom and a little bit of loneliness. To pass the time, I decided to watch a horror movie. I loved the thrill of being scared, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. I made myself some popcorn, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch. I chose a classic horror film, one that I had heard was truly terrifying. The lights were off, and the only illumination came from the flickering screen. The movie began with an eerie soundtrack, setting the mood perfectly. As the movie progressed, I found myself getting more and more engrossed in the story. The tension was building, and my heart was racing. Every creak and groan of the house seemed to echo the movie's sounds, adding to the atmosphere. I was so wrapped up in the film that I didn't notice the time passing. About halfway through the movie, just as the main character was about to uncover a dark secret, I felt a sudden chill. It wasn't the kind of chill that comes from being scared, but a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to ignore it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow moved across the hallway, just beyond the living room door. I paused the movie and stared into the darkness. straining my eyes to see if it was just my imagination. The house was silent, and the only sound was my own breathing. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light or maybe the wind moving something outside. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to investigate, hoping to put my mind at ease. I slowly got up from the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked to the hallway, turning on the lights as I went. The hallway was empty, but the sense of unease remained. I checked each room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was exactly as it should be. Feeling a bit silly for getting so worked up, I returned to the living room and resumed the movie. I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to the shadow. As the movie reached its climax, I felt another cold draft, this time stronger. I looked towards the hallway again, and there it was, the shadow. It was clearer this time, a tall, dark figure that seemed to move slowly and deliberately. My heart was in my throat as I watched it glide silently down the hallway and disappear into the kitchen. I was frozen with fear, unsure of what to do. Gathering all the courage I could muster, I grabbed my phone and a flashlight. I dialed my best friend's number, but there was no answer. I took a deep breath and decided to follow the shadow into the kitchen. The kitchen was dark, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I shone the flashlight around, but there was no sign of the shadow. I checked the doors and windows. They were all locked. I was starting to think I had imagined the whole thing when I heard a faint whisper. It was a soft, almost inaudible sound, like someone calling my name. I spun around, shining the flashlight everywhere, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, sending chills down my spine. I backed out of and racing. I decided to leave the house and stay with a friend for the night. As I gathered my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching me. I rushed out the door, locking it behind me, and didn't look back. The next day, I returned home with a friend, determined to find out what had happened. We searched the entire house, but there was no trace of the shadow. I never found out what it was or where it came from, but from that night on, I couldn't watch a horror movie alone without feeling that cold draft and seeing that shadow in the corner of my eye. It was a quiet night at the gas station where I worked. Located on the outskirts of town, it didn't see much activity after dark. Most nights were uneventful, and I would pass the time reading or listening to music. But this night was different. The clock on the wall showed it was almost midnight. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a stark light over the rows of snacks and drinks. I was restocking shelves when I noticed the first sign of something unusual. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move across the parking lot. I looked up, but there was nothing there. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks with the lights. I continued with my work, trying to ignore the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. A few minutes later, I saw it again. This time the shadow was closer, near the gas pumps. It was a tall, dark figure, indistinct and almost blending into the night. My heart started to race as I watched it glide silently towards the building. I went to the window for a better look, but it was gone. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light or a stray animal casting weird shadows. But as I turned back to my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The station was empty, with no customers in sight. I decided to step outside and have a look around. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the cool night air. The parking lot was deserted, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I walked around the pumps and towards the darkened edge of the lot, where the light from the station barely reached. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing unusual. Just as I was about to head back inside, I saw the shadow again. It was standing at the edge of the light, just beyond the pumps. This time it didn't move. It was as if it was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight directly at it. The beam passed through the figure, revealing nothing but empty air. Panic started to set in. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the spot where the shadow had been. As I reached the door, I turned and hurried inside, locking it behind me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. I returned to the counter and watched the security monitors, hoping to see something that would explain the strange shadow. For a while, everything was normal. Then, the monitors started to flicker. Static filled the screens, and when the picture cleared, the shadow was there, standing just outside the door. My blood ran cold. I watched in horror as the figure moved closer, seeming to glide effortlessly across the ground. It stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, I thought it might come inside. But it just stood there, an ominous presence in the night. Suddenly, the lights inside the station flickered and went out, plunging the place into darkness. The only light came from the flickering security monitors and my flashlight. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door, but the shadow was gone. I felt a cold draft, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. I knew I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my phone and called my manager, but there was no answer. Desperate, I decided to wait out the rest of my shift in my car. I locked the station and ran to my car, looking around nervously. As I sat in the car watching the gas station from a distance, I saw the shadow again. It moved slowly around the pumps, then disappeared into the darkness. The feeling of dread didn't leave me until the sun started to rise, and the first light of dawn chased away the shadows. I never figured out what that shadow was or where it came from. After that night, I couldn't work the graveyard shift alone anymore. The memory of that shadowy figure haunted me, a reminder of the night I came face to face with something truly terrifying. My family had always lived in the same old house, a large Victorian place that had been passed down through generations. It was a beautiful home with tall windows, creaky wooden floors, and a sense of history in every corner. However, there was one part of the house that remained off limits: the basement. The basement had been locked ever since my grandpa's time. My father was very strict about keeping it that way. Whenever I asked about it, he would quickly change the subject or sternly tell me never to go down there. His reactions only made me more curious. One rainy afternoon, when I was home alone, I found myself staring at the locked basement door. My curiosity had been building for years, and I decided it was time to find out what was hidden down there. I rummaged through my dad's study, searching for the key. After a thorough search, I found it hidden in a drawer, buried under old papers. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as it swung open, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the unknown. I grabbed a flashlight and started my descent, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The basement smelled musty and the air was cold and damp. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling and dust covered every surface. As I shone the flashlight around, I saw old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and shelves lined with jars filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. In the corner of the room, I noticed a large old trunk. It looked ancient with its leather straps and metal hinges. The trunk drew me in, and I felt a strange compulsion to open it. I knelt down and slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside, I found old photographs, letters, and a few trinkets that must have belonged to my grandpa. As I sifted through the items, I came across a worn journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it and began to read. It was my grandpa's journal, detailing his life and his experiences in the house. The entries started out normal, recounting daily events and family matters. But as I read further, the tone of the journal changed. Grandpa wrote about strange occurrences in the house, particularly in the basement. He mentioned hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling a presence that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The entries became more frantic, with Grandpa describing how the presence grew stronger and more malevolent over time. One of the last entries mentioned a seance that Grandpa and his friends had conducted in the basement, trying to communicate with whatever was haunting the house. They had hoped to put it to rest, but instead, they seemed to have angered it. Grandpa wrote about how the spirit had become more violent, and in a desperate attempt to protect the family, he had locked the basement and warned everyone never to open it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I read the final words in the journal. The spirit is trapped, but not forever. It waits, and it remembers. Suddenly, I heard a soft whispering sound behind me. I turned, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. Panic surged through me, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. When my father came home, he found me pale and shaken. I confessed everything, and he sighed deeply, looking more tired and sad than angry. "I warned you for a reason," he said quietly. "That spirit, it's part of our family's dark history. Your grandpa tried to protect us, and we must respect that. We relocked the basement, and I vowed never to go down there again. The house seemed different after that day, the shadows a little darker and the nights a little colder. I learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some doors should never be opened." Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to a channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share the stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I had just moved to the city for college and needed a place to stay. I found an old building near the campus with cheap rent. The landlord told me that I would have a roommate, but he was hardly ever home. That sounded perfect to me, so I moved in right away. The building was old and a bit creepy with creaky floors and dim lighting. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. When I arrived, my roommate wasn't there. His room was locked, and I didn't think much of it. I unpacked my things and settled in. That first night, I heard strange noises. It sounded like someone walking in the hallway, but when I checked, no one was there. I figured it was just the old building making noises and went back to bed. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. It said, "Welcome. Sorry I missed you. I work late hours. John." I was glad to finally have some communication with my roommate, even if it was just a note. Over the next few days, I noticed odd things. Sometimes I would hear whispering coming from John's room. Other times I would find things moved around in the apartment. I started to feel uneasy, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. One night, I was studying late when I heard a loud thump from John's room. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and peeked inside. The room was empty. There were no personal items, no clothes, nothing that showed someone lived there. Just an old, dusty bed and a broken chair. My heart started to race. Where was John? I decided to call the landlord. He answered quickly, and I explained the situation. There was a long pause before he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't want to scare you. John used to live there, but he died in an accident over a year ago." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Then who has been leaving me notes and moving things around?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," the landlord replied, "but you're not the first tenant to notice strange things. People say his spirit never left." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and left the apartment that night. The next day, I found a new place to live. It was more expensive, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back to that old building. The memory of the empty room and the mysterious notes haunted me. A reminder of the strange and terrifying experience I had with a roommate who was no longer among the living. We had recently moved to the quiet town of Alderbrook, seeking peace and a fresh start. My family and I were enchanted by the charm of our new neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. However, it wasn't long before we began to notice something strange. Every night, around midnight, we would hear eerie sounds coming from the house next door. It was a large old house, slightly run down but still holding on to its former grandeur. The sounds were faint but unmistakable. Muffled cries, soft thuds, and a peculiar scraping noise that sent shivers down our spines. One particularly restless night, after yet another round of unsettling noises, I decided to speak to our neighbor, Tony, the next day. He was an elderly man, always polite but somewhat reclusive. When I approached him, he seemed reluctant to talk, but after some persuasion he agreed to explain the situation. We sat in his dimly lit living room, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Tony sighed deeply, his eyes haunted by memories as he began to recount the story. "It all started many years ago," he said in a low voice. "My wife Margaret and I bought this house shortly after we were married. We were happy here for a time, but then things began to change." Tony's eyes seemed to look through me, lost in the past. "It began with small things, objects moving on their own, strange cold spots, and whispers in the night. We tried to ignore it, rationalize it, but it only got worse. One night, we heard the most horrifying scream coming from the basement. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "Margaret insisted we investigate. She was brave, always braver than me. We went down into the basement, and that's when we found it." My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned in, captivated by his story. "Found what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "There was an old, forgotten room down there, hidden behind a false wall. Inside, remains of a child, a girl no older than 10. She'd been there for decades, long before we moved in. The police were called, and an investigation was conducted, but they never found out who she was or how she ended up there." He took a deep, shaky breath. "After that night, the noises became more frequent, more intense. Margaret couldn't take it. She fell into a deep depression and eventually, she took her own life." A heavy silence filled the room as Tony struggled to compose himself. "I've tried everything to put her spirit to rest," he continued, "but nothing works. The sounds you hear at night, it's her. She's trapped down there, unable to move on." I felt a cold dread settle over me as I listened to his tale. "Is there anything we can do to help?" I asked, feeling a mix of fear and compassion. Tony shook his head sadly. "I don't know. I've tried priests, mediums, everything. But maybe fresh eyes, a new perspective could make a difference." That night, I couldn't sleep. The story weighed heavily on my mind, and the sounds seemed louder, more desperate. I discussed it with my wife, and we decided to try and help Tony. The next day, we gathered some friends and made our way into his basement. The air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of decay lingered. We found the hidden room just as Mr. Tony had described. It was a small, dark space, the walls covered in ancient, peeling wallpaper. In the center lay a small, decayed bed and the remnants of old, tattered toys. We decided to conduct a simple ritual, hoping to bring some peace to the restless spirit. We lit candles, said prayers, and spoke to the spirit, asking for forgiveness and offering our help to guide her to the other side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and we heard a faint, sorrowful whisper. It was a child's voice, full of pain and longing. "Help me," it said. We continued our prayers, and slowly the atmosphere began to change. The coldness receded and a feeling of peace washed over us. The whispering stopped, and the basement felt lighter, less oppressive. That night, for the first time since we moved in, we slept peacefully. The sounds had stopped, and Tony, though still grieving, seemed relieved. A few days later, we received a letter from him, thanking us for our help. He believed that the spirit of the little girl had finally found peace, and in a way, so had he. Life in Alderbrook returned to normal, but we would never forget the haunting sounds of that old house or the tragic story of the child who had been trapped there for so long. It was a chilling reminder that some secrets buried in the past can still reach out and touch the present, seeking resolution and peace. Last summer, I decided to take a vacation and booked an Airbnb in a small, quiet town. The pictures online looked perfect. A cozy cottage surrounded by trees, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. I was excited for a peaceful getaway. When I arrived, the cottage looked just as charming as the photos. The host, a friendly woman named Claire, handed me the keys and showed me around. "You'll have the place to yourself," she said with a warm smile. "Enjoy your stay." The first evening was relaxing. I cooked a simple dinner, watched some TV, and read a book before bed. The cottage was quiet, except for the sounds of crickets outside. I fell asleep quickly, feeling content. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like someone was walking around the house. I listened carefully, but the noise stopped. I told myself it was just the old house settling and went back to sleep. The next day, I explored the town and met some of the locals. They were friendly and welcoming. One old man, Mr. Thompson, asked where I was staying. When I mentioned the cottage, his expression changed. "That place has a history," he said. "People say it's haunted." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me. "Haunted by what?" I asked. "By its previous owner," he replied. "She was a recluse and died alone. Some say she never left." That night, back at the cottage, I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Thompson had said. I tried to brush it off as a local legend, but as I lay in bed, I heard the noises again, footsteps, this time louder and closer. I got up and checked the house, but everything seemed normal. I locked all the doors and windows, feeling a bit uneasy. Just as I was about to go back to bed, I noticed something strange. The mirror in the hallway was foggy, as if someone had breathed on it. I wiped the mirror with my hand, but as soon as I did, I saw a faint outline of a face behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I decided to sleep with the lights on. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of whispers. I couldn't understand the words, but they were coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly making my way toward the sound. The whispers grew louder, leading me to the living room. There, in the dim light, I saw her, a ghostly figure of an old woman standing by the window, looking out into the night. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was sad. She turned to me and whispered, "Why are you here?" Terrified, I backed away, but she vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. I didn't wait to see if she would come back. I grabbed my things, got into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. The next morning, I called Claire and told her what happened. She was silent for a moment before admitting, "You're not the first guest to see her. The house has always had strange occurrences. I'm sorry, I'll refund your stay." I found a hotel in town for the rest of my vacation. It was more expensive, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back to that cottage. The memory of the ghostly figure haunted me, a reminder that some places hold on to their past, and not all who stay there are truly gone. I had always dreamed of owning a house, and when I saw the old Victorian on Willow Street listed at a fraction of its market value, I couldn't resist. The house was beautiful despite its age, with intricate woodwork, a grand staircase, and large windows that let in plenty of light. The only downside, according to the rumors, was that it was haunted. Stories of ghostly figures in the basement and strange noises had kept the price low, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I was certain that all it needed was a little TLC to become my dream home. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning and organizing, uncovering the beauty hidden beneath years of neglect. But every time I walked past the basement door, a chill would run down my spine. It was always cold near that door, colder than any other part of the house. I shrugged it off as a draft and continued with my work. One night, while unpacking in the living room, I heard a noise from the basement. I had always dreamed of owning a house, and when I saw the old Victorian It was a faint scratching, barely audible but unmistakable in the silent house. My heart raced, but I forced myself to be rational. It was probably just a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the creaky stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt thick, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The scratching had stopped, but I could still feel a presence, an almost tangible weight pressing down on me. I swept the flashlight around the room, illuminating old furniture covered in dusty sheets, stacks of boxes and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. There was no sign of any animal. Just as I was about to go back upstairs, I noticed something strange. One of the walls looked different, newer than the rest. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to inspect it more closely. The wall was made of bricks that didn't match the age of the house. I tapped on it, and it sounded hollow. My mind raced with possibilities. It was a faint. Perhaps there was a hidden room or a forgotten passage. Excited and a little scared, I fetched a hammer and started chipping away at the mortar. It was hard work, but eventually, I removed enough bricks to create a small opening. The cold air that rushed out was even colder than the basement itself, and it smelled of earth and decay. I shone the flashlight inside and saw a narrow, dark corridor leading further into the depths of the house. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, and the floor was uneven dirt. As I crawled through the opening, the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I felt a surge of fear but pushed on, driven by curiosity. The corridor led to a small circular room. In the center of the room was an old iron-bound chest. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. The air felt even heavier here, almost oppressive. I knelt down and with trembling hands lifted the lid. Inside the chest were old photographs, letters, and a few trinkets. Perhaps they seemed to belong to a family that had lived in the house long ago. As I sifted through the items, I found a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it and began to read. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. Her entries started out normal, detailing her life and her love for her family. But as I read on, the entries became darker. Eleanor wrote about strange noises coming from the basement, about feeling watched, and about her growing fear for her family's safety. The last few entries were frantic, filled with terror. Eleanor wrote about a presence in the basement, something evil that wanted to harm her family. She described how her husband had bricked up the corridor to protect them, sealing whatever it was inside. Her final entry ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence, "It's here." Suddenly the flashlight went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. They seemed to belong to a family. I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper, barely audible but clear. "Leave." Panic surged through me. I scrambled out of the corridor, through the hole in the wall, and up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent. I never went back. I sold the house at a loss, unable to face whatever it was that lurked in the basement. To this day, I can still hear that whisper in my nightmares, and I know that some doors are better left unlocked.